Sink by Deborah Jane Adelson. Iris flicked on the light, and the darkness resolved itself into a grandmotherly living room, comfortably furnished with worn dusky rose armchairs, framed family photographs, and palm-sized china figurines. Mrs. Chesney lived alone, according to the little that Iris had been able to find out about her. Iris dumped her bag on the nearest armchair and rubbed her aching neck. There was an underlying feeling about this place. She closed her eyes and listened. Whatever it was distant, somnolent. "Rough day?" Bruce asked, grinning when she shrieked and jumped. "Don't do that!" "I didn't expect you to be so jittery. Frankly," Bruce said, brushing his rough fingers over the heads of delicately painted china shepherdesses, "I didn't expect you to come." "I said I would." Bruce grunted and idly dumped his bag next to hers. "Geez," he said, picking up a particularly vivid yellow duck, obviously made out of Sculpey. "My dad would have thrashed me up the wall if I'd dumped my failed art projects to my grandparents for Christmas." He waggled the duck at her. It was a playful movement, but not a friendly one. "Here you go, Granny," he mimicked. "Hope this makes up for never visiting. Be sure not to spend our inheritance before you die." "Stop it, Bruce," Iris said, more sharply than she'd intended. "Let's get on with the job." "Dunno," Bruce said with a sneering joviality so unlike him. "I'd say some of these clay animals were ripe for possession." "No." "Fine. You win like usual. Back to work, work, work." "You're the one who asked me here," Iris reminded him. "I thought—" She caught his sharp look, and she stumbled, ending her sentence in a mumble. "It was important." Bruce ran his tongue over his teeth, regarding her with a look that she turned away from. Her hand was trembling, and she curled her fingers tensely. None of that. They'd worked together 100 times, and this must be no different. The silence grew uncomfortable long before Bruce spoke again. When he did, he sounded more like himself. "Our client's name is Eleanor Rose Chesney," he said. "Goes by Rosie. You've looked up the history of the house?" Iris nodded. "It was built in the early 1800s and has passed through at least 20 owners. I couldn't find any scandals associated with it, or, frankly, anything else, relevant or not. I assume Mrs. Chesney told you more." "Not much." Bruce dug through his bag and came up with a folder. He consulted the pages inside, rattling off the facts. "Rosie's a widow, moved to town after her husband's death 30 years ago." "Buried?" "Cremated. Probably not the cause of the current trouble, unless Rosie's lying about what she did with the ashes." Iris wrinkled her nose. People did the strangest things with loved ones' ashes and then lied about it, as if Iris's team wouldn't find out the truth eventually. "For the record," Bruce said, "I don't think she was lying. The house is old, but Rosie never heard anything bad about it, and she didn't experience any events until 6 weeks back. The disturbances started out small, stuff Rosie could dismiss as faulty wiring and noisy plumbing. Lights flickering, footsteps in empty rooms. It only really escalated in the past few days when she started hearing voices, scared the living daylights out of her." Iris waited. "And?" she prompted. "That's it," Bruce said, closing the file. "She contacted me and made it my problem." "What did you expect, Iris?" he asked at her expression. "She's an old lady, not a professor of paranormal phenomena." Iris didn't smile. It was as much as she could do not to make her tone actively aggressive when she said, "Then let's get started." They fell into their routine without much discussion. Bruce began taking EMF readings. Not all paranormal activity showed up in the electromagnetic field, but a lot of it did. And Iris put her hands on the back of the sofa, closed her eyes, and reached out with her senses. Bruce left her to it. His heavy footsteps plodded upstairs, the EMF meter muttering to itself. Putting him out of her mind and quieting her racing thoughts and emotions, Iris turned off the light. She stood by the front door, hands pressed against the wall, hunting for the something she'd sensed before. She'd always been the strongest medium in the group, even stronger than Amelia. Yes, she could sense it again. Elusive, tenuous, but definitely real. It was stronger in the living room than in the dining room, but neither place was the heart of it. She had to keep searching. Iris felt her way toward the corridor. The house wasn't large for a family, but poor Mrs. Chesney must have rattled around in it like a penny in a plastic Easter egg. 3 bedrooms upstairs, the open space downstairs, and 4 rooms here on the ground floor. Iris passed the stairs up and the door to the basement stairs and paused by the bathroom. She had a particular dislike for haunted bathrooms, but when she went in she found it had no more atmosphere than the dining room. Bruce must be about done upstairs, she thought, twisting the kitchen doorknob and pushing in. She stopped on the threshold. Was the air chillier here than in the hallway? Maybe slightly, she decided. Very slightly. It might be nothing. She stepped through and into an atmosphere as thick and greasy as a cheap hamburger joint. Strong, unhealthy emotions tingled the hairs on the backs of her arms, and she thought she could almost hear voices. After a moment she fumbled for the light switch. The atmosphere receded somewhat under the glare of the kitchen light. A black marble counter, supported by white cabinets, dominated the room, wrapping around from the center to the back. More white cabinets with black handles hugged the wall, breaking off only to make space for oven, sink, and refrigerator. Everything that could be scrubbed clean had been. It might have been a showroom, except that here too were family photos and palm-sized china figurines. Iris trailed her fingers along the counter. This room had been redone, and recently, but the feelings she got here were closer, not more distant. Whatever had caused the haunting, it had occurred after the kitchen had been remodeled. Thumping footfalls warned Iris a second before Bruce barged through the door, his square features downturned with dissatisfaction. "Nothing?" Iris asked him. "Not a peep," he said, dumping his EMF meter on the counter. "Damn thing's useless. Not that I sensed anything up there. You?" Yes," Iris said, eyes going distant as she brushed her fingers over the cabinet. "This room's important, I think. There's something here, but not here, or not yet. It's in the living room also, but weaker. Did you get any idea from Mrs. Chesney what type of ghost this is? I mean, does it go in predictable circles, or is it prompted by certain stimuli?" "You're expecting her to pay attention like a sensible person," Bruce said disgustedly. "She's an old woman." "Old women can be sensible." "Listen to how defensive you are, afraid you'll end up like her, pretending to be happy. There's a guest room upstairs, the sheets that smell like they haven't been used in a dog's age, and a pile of quilts taller than your head. She makes them, the sewing room's full of them, but no one wants them, do they?" "What happened to you, Bruce?" she wondered, massaging her neck. But of course she knew the answer to that. "Maybe I'll ask for a quilt as payment," she said. "Not as my half of the payment you won't." Bruce didn't bother waiting for her answer. He breezed past, saying, "Basement's this way." Iris caught up with him as he opened the door to the basement stairs. Cool, close air wafted out, pregnant with the weight of accumulated years. Iris laid one hand against the doorframe, and again she found heavy expectation. "What's it waiting for?" she murmured. Mrs. Chesney clearly didn't spend much time in the basement. The main room was cluttered with decaying boxes and forgotten keepsakes. Ancient furniture stood ghost-like under white shrouds. "Slight EMF reading here," Bruce commented. He'd opened a door at the opposite end of the basement. "Get your thermometer out." 58 degrees, Iris said, joining him in the room. It was 68 upstairs, but basements are normally— "Oh!" She gasped as she stepped into a spike of cold. Shivering, she backed up and checked the thermometer again. The cold spot was near the center of the room. It wasn't large, maybe 16 inches in diameter, and it measured only 39 degrees on the thermometer. There was no gap in the floor below or in the ceiling above, and a licked finger detected no breeze. "Not just an old lady's imaginings," Bruce said. "No," Iris agreed, untying her cardigan from around her waist and putting it on. She steadied herself and got her bearings. The floor was bare concrete, the ceiling unfinished wood, the single overhead light drab yellow-orange. To the right were furnace and hot water heater, along with plenty of silvery ducts. To the left, a large freezer in a particularly hideous shade of olive green. "Might as well get the worst over with," Bruce said, following her gaze. He hoisted the freezer lid up with both hands and looked inside. After a pause, he bent in and shuffled through the contents. "Want an ice cream bar?" he asked Iris. "She has a collection you wouldn't believe. No dead bodies, though." "I'll pass, thanks." Iris turned to the furnace and hot water heater. Both were plugged in, but only the hot water heater was presently active. She laid her hand on the side of the furnace, breathed out, and closed her eyes. The air shifted as Bruce moved her way. "Stay there," she ordered. "I'm trying to concentrate." "I didn't move," he protested through a mouthful of ice cream. Iris's eyes snapped open. Sure enough, Bruce was where she'd left him, freezer door open. "I could have sworn," she began, then broke off and shook her head, rubbing her neck awkwardly. "Never mind. I'm going to turn it on." Iris flipped its switch, and the furnace burst to life. It sucked in air greedily, instantly growing warm. Movement caught the corner of Iris's eye, and she whipped her head around, but it was gone. She had the strangest feeling there was someone else in the room with them, and the atmosphere thickened. Not like oil, as it had in the kitchen, but like the sick, suffocating pressure of too little air. Iris gasped, head spinning. She put her hands to her throat, but she couldn't breathe. Voices echoed distantly, and spots danced in her vision. Bruce shut the furnace off, and it was over. Iris gasped in air, and it flooded her screaming lungs. The light overhead burned steadily, casting weak, predictable shadows. "So," Bruce said. Iris passed a shaking hand over her face. "Let's go back to the kitchen and regroup," she said. "It was less intense in there, and I think that's where it started." "Sure," Bruce agreed sarcastically. "Whatever you say." In their absence, some of the heaviness had lifted from the kitchen, leaving it a perfectly comfortable, ordinary room. Iris poured herself some water and gulped it down. She braced the glass on the side of the sink, focusing on the swan-like curve of the faucet, getting a hold of herself. At least now she knew why Bruce had called her here. "As I see it," Bruce said, propping his sturdy bulk on one of the stools, "whoever lived here had an argument in the kitchen, and then the murderer dragged his victim downstairs to the furnace room before killing her." "You would know better than I would," Iris said. "What's that supposed to mean?" Iris faced him, eyes hot. "You've been withholding information. You know more about this place than you've let on." Bruce rolled his eyes and crossed his arms. "Like what?" "Like the fact that this ghost is dangerous. I couldn't breathe down there. Tell me the truth, Bruce. Why didn't you tell me it was a poltergeist?" "Would you have come if I had?" "Of course I would have, but I would have come prepared. I didn't bring any poltergeist equipment, Bruce, and that'll make our job 10 times more difficult, not to mention more dangerous. You should never withhold information with me. Never." Bruce's square features contorted in fury, brick red. "You hypocrite," he spat. "You effing hypocrite. I never purposefully withheld information. Except when it came to Amelia." Iris made a disgusted noise. "For heaven's sake, Bruce, she was young enough to be your daughter." Bruce's lips twisted in an ugly smile. "You'll use any excuse, won't you?" "It's not my fault she died, Bruce." "Then whose is it?" Bruce demanded, lunging to his feet. "Tell me that!" Iris held her ground. "Our job is dangerous. Accidents happen. The house wasn't sound. She should have known better than to go wandering around with an active poltergeist loose." "She couldn't have known the floor wouldn't hold her, because you didn't tell her." "If she'd done her research like I told her to, instead of messing around—" "But you knew!" Bruce shouted. "You knew it wasn't safe. You knew she hadn't done her research, and you didn't tell her." Iris drew herself up, acid churning in her stomach. "Is that what you brought me here for? To accuse me? That's low, Bruce, even for you." She stalked around him, back, ramrod straight, and slammed the door behind her. For good measure she slammed it again, twice before stomping away, panting with anger. "That bastard! How dare he! How dare—" The kitchen door slammed again, and Iris snarled. If Bruce thought he was going to follow her— But it wasn't Bruce. There was no one there. Iris exhaled noisily, and her breath fogged white. The kitchen door opened on its own and slammed a second time, then a third. Iris backed up to the stairs and gripped the banister. A presence floated toward her from the kitchen door. She leaned away, and it evaporated before it reached her. Stillness descended, but not peace. Her fuzzy breath whitened the air, and the lights fluttered. Iris didn't move, and she didn't call out. She waited, stretching her senses, and wondering what was going on in the kitchen. The kitchen door slid open slowly, invitingly. Iris didn't move. She'd once seen a ghost hunter lose his hand that way. Slam, slam, slam. Iris backed up a step onto the bottom stair. Slam, 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 slam. Over and over, faster and faster, and every third slam a presence emerged. The presences moved no more quickly than before, and soon began overlapping, moving toward her but always evaporating before they reached the stairs. She could see them now, faintly, like faded, blurry shadows in midair, overlapping until she couldn't tell where one ended and the next began. Then, as abruptly as it had started, the slamming stopped, and the last of the figures evaporated. It was colder than ever. The hall and kitchen lights went out, and the dining and living room lights lit up on their own. Iris heard the small sounds of gentle movement in the living room, no more than 5 or 6 feet away. The seat of an armchair dipped. One presence. No, 2. The murmur of indistinguishable voices buzzed in her ears. Slam. 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 There were voices coming from the kitchen now, furious voices screaming indistinguishable words. "What is it?" Iris asked softly, calmingly. "What's making you so angry? Show us what happened." Slam, slam, slam. A presence emerged from the door and came her way, but this time, instead of veering toward her, it went straight for the basement stairs. Almost delicately it opened the door and shut it again. Slam, slam, slam. The presence came more quickly, and this time it slammed the basement door. That slam had been too close for comfort. Iris crawled backward up the stairs. The air was thinner on the landing and much warmer. By the time she had reached the upper floor, she couldn't see her breath at all, and the slamming seemed to have stopped. She counted to 60 before venturing back down to the landing. The hall light burned steadily. Her breath was invisible. The feeling of presence was gone, as were the voices. They stayed gone when she stepped back onto the ground floor. No. Wait. They weren't entirely gone. They had merely receded. They could start up again at any moment. Iris eyed the kitchen door suspiciously, but she'd learned to trust her instincts, and her instincts told her that it was over for now. Trying not to think about it too hard, she yanked the door open and stepped sharply back. The door shushed on the carpet, but it didn't slam. Bruce waited for her by the sink, skin white and eyes straining. "Our poltergeist is making fun of us," he remarked. "It's mimicking us." "We're not the only ones who ever slam doors," Iris reminded him. "But I think you were right. There was an argument here, but it came to a head in the furnace room. Did you notice how it was looping? The ghost's last hours repeated over and over for eternity. Did Mrs. Chesney experience anything like this? No wonder she was frightened." Bruce shook his head. "I don't think it ever got this bad. It's reacting to us, to our negative emotions. Couldn't you feel them? The air was thick with them in here." "I'm not sure how aware it was of us," Iris objected, "but I tried to talk to it. It seemed to be saying that we wouldn't find anything up here. We'd better take another look at the furnace room. But stay alert and don't provoke it. And don't turn the furnace on." The furnace was already on when they arrived, its blazing heat kept close by layers of insulation and shielding. Even so, Bruce had to wrap his sleeve around his hand before he could get close enough to switch it off. 52 degrees, Iris announced, checking the thermometer. Cold spots down to 30 degrees. "We'll find out what happened," she said to any listening ghost. "We'll solve your murder and you can rest. Any help you could provide us would be welcome." There was no answer. Iris hadn't really expected there would be. If it were a wood furnace, Bruce said, I'd say that was our best bet for evidence, but I don't think you could burn a body in a gas furnace without taking the whole thing apart. A secret room? This house is about the right age for the Underground Railroad. How cliché, Iris murmured, but obediently began tapping on walls, stretching her senses and listening for hollow spots. The atmosphere grew thicker than before, anticipatory but not yet active, and the only voices she could hear were so distant as to be illusory. Here, Bruce said, stopping his search on one side of the furnace, at a blank stretch of wall. He knocked rapidly on it, then on the wall beside it. There's something here. He took a step back, braced himself, and kicked out sideways. The wood echoed, and the sole of Bruce's shoe smeared a blackish mark on the whitewash, but the wall remained solid. Bruce scowled and stomped out. He was back 2 minutes later with an axe he always took into haunted houses for precisely this purpose. Iris kept her senses peeled as he hacked through the wall, but she couldn't feel any reaction from the ghost or ghosts. It was as if whoever had died didn't care whether they found the room. Iris shivered and realized her fingers had gone numb on the thermometer, so there was a reaction after all. 44 degrees, she said. Bruce? There's nothing in here, Bruce announced. The room's completely empty. There aren't even rat droppings. Bruce, Iris said, it's 43 degrees out here and the furnace has come back on. Hair rose on the back of her neck and she edged closer to the furnace. She could hear the air rushing through it, but the heat radiated no more than an inch from its surface. Beyond that, there was only the cold. Iris's breath plumed in the air, and the ceiling creaked with footsteps. Slam went the kitchen door, muffled by distance. Slam, slam. Bruce stepped back into the furnace room, head cocked, attentive. He rested his weight on the head of the axe. Slam, slam, slam. Distant, indistinct voices raised in anger. Footsteps on the basement stairs, one set slow, the other fast. The furnace room door swung shut, then opened again. Iris sidestepped a presence, but it ignored her. Another followed, and another. They seemed genuinely oblivious to her presence. The lights wavered. What happened here? Iris asked softly. Show us where to look? Movement caught her eye, and didn't disappear when she looked more closely. It was a shadow on the wall, faint and muzzy. Another joined it, and then both evaporated. The freezer lip opened and slammed shut. You're dead, Iris told the presences, and they echoed it back to her. You're dead, you're dead, you're dead, you're dead. You're repeating the same actions over and over, looping. You need to stop. Show us what happened to you. What's keeping you here? The air shifted as Bruce joined her, standing just behind her shoulder. She looked up at him, and the furnace room door slammed shut. Are you frightened, Iris? Bruce asked. Iris, 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 some of the voices echoed. Others rose in indistinct fury, and still others kept whispering, You're dead, you're dead, you're dead, you're dead. Iris licked her lips and plucked the digital voice recorder from Bruce's belt. They might as well record this since they had the chance. Invisible hands pounded on the walls and dust gusted up from the floor of the secret room. Iris, 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 chanted the voices. Iris, they said one last time, and fell silent, expectant. The banging stopped too, and the door slammed shut and stayed that way, but it was colder than ever, and the lights flickered continually. I wonder if this is how Amelia felt before she died, Bruce said, like the world had gone mad around her and she was helpless to stop it. Drop it, will you? Iris hissed. Can't you feel it's not over? Bruce's jaw hardened and he leaned over her, his breath hot and stinking. You knew that poltergeist was dangerous, he growled, just like you knew that house was rotting from the inside out. I asked the owner. He'd told you the floor wasn't safe. One wrong step, that's all it would take. Iris planted her hands in her hips, anger overcoming her caution. I didn't know she'd be stupid enough to walk on a clearly unstable floor. But you hoped she would. Don't deny it. Iris opened her mouth with the lie stuck in her throat. She rubbed the side of her neck, unable to look him in the eye. "It wasn't like that," she protested weakly. Like that, murmured the voices distantly. "You're dead, you're dead, you're dead." "You were jealous," Bruce said, eyes glinting with fury, "and so you murdered her." "I didn't." "You did!" he roared, hefting his axe. Iris gasped, too shocked to do more than raise her hands. "You hated her from the first day you met her." "That's not true! You jealous bitch! You murdered her!" "No!" Iris cried, stepping back. Bruce followed her, panting, drawing the axe back over his shoulder. "I loved her, and you murdered her." "Stop it!" Iris screamed, stumbling back into the cold spot. Freezing air shocked through her, stealing the breath from her lungs. The axe blurred. Pain exploded through her neck. She crumpled to the ground, choking on her own blood. Bruce dropped the axe and looked down at her for an endless moment. Then he grasped her heels and hauled her toward the secret room to die alone in the darkness. Iris flicked on the light, and the darkness resolved itself into her grandmotherly living room, comfortably furnished with worn dusky rose armchairs, framed family photographs, and palm-sized china figurines. Mrs. Chesney lived alone.